Now, of course, before you start jumping up and down for the joy of common sense, to bear in mind that Aristotle does not mean by happiness what you probably mean by happiness. So the average person probably takes happiness to be pleasure or feeling good, but Aristotle denies that. He says, look, the common person who thinks that pleasure is the same as happiness degrades human beings to the level of a common animal. So take your average cow or pig or donkey. Their highest goal is probably pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That's really what their life amounts to. So they are happy so long as they just out there chewing the cud, grazing in the sun, not being bothered or eaten or slaughtered or anything like that. They just have pleasure, right? That probably feels good for them, and that's really all that a cow can aspire to. But human beings, of course, are not cows. And Aristotle's view is that what distinguishes a human being from a cow, we're both animals, by the way, right? So often we talk as though we're not animals, and we use the word animal to distinguish things which are not human from things which are human. So we say, I'm not an animal, damn it. And what you mean is you don't eat with your hands or poop outside or go without clothing or etc., etc. But of course, ultimately, according to science, we are animals. We're part of the animal kingdom. We're animals, but we're different from all other animals. There's something unique about us, and Aristotle was aware of that, obviously. What was unique about us was reasoning. Now, by reasoning, Aristotle means something very specific. In particular, he means syllogistic reasoning, logical reasoning, as exemplified by such patterns of inference as all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. So Socrates is you should have heard the word mortal in your minds just then, because that's what follows from those first two premises. If it's true that all men are mortal, and if it's true that Socrates is a man, then it must be true that Socrates is immortal. You can kind of see, just by thinking about it, that it doesn't make sense for someone to say, yes, I agree, it's absolutely true, all men are mortal, obviously. Of course, Socrates was also a man, but he was not immortal. Someone who said that would either be making a bad joke or just confused about the words, or if they weren't, then they don't really have rational capabilities to see that that's a contradiction, that can't be the case. Now, that's just one example of the kind of logical reasoning that human beings are capable of that no animal is capable of. So maybe pleasure isn't a fit goal for an animal. And so for animals, that are not rational, for non-rational animals, that may be a fit goal. But for rational animals, pleasure is not a fit goal. It's not the thing that we aim at or should be aiming at, because it lowers our status to that of an ordinary cow or monkey or donkey. Now, on another note, why pleasure can't be happiness and why we can't just recommend that everyone seek pleasure, that be the goal of every human action, is because pleasure can be derived from wicked behavior. So, for instance, someone who gets pleasure from lying or from stealing, take your kleptomaniac, someone who doesn't need the thing that they're stealing, but just enjoys it. They like the rush of it, the thrill of it. So famously, I guess, or allegedly, Winona Ryder has this. It's a thrill to get away with something. You take a little thing from the store, no one catches you, get a small rush from it, so you're getting some pleasure from that. But of course, stealing is wrong, it's wicked. So here's a case where the pleasure doesn't seem to be good. doesn't seem as though we want to say that that's good in that case, because the action which produced that pleasure is itself immoral. So there's these two reasons Aristotle thinks. Yeah, the common person, the average person, they think that happiness is pleasure, but they're wrong, because that neglects the thing which is special or unique about humans, which distinguishes us from other animals, our rational faculties, and it also neglects this weird thing that if you say that pleasure is the ultimate goal that all our actions are aiming at and that it's intrinsically good, then you're forced to say that in the case of pleasure derived from wicked behavior, and Aristotle just doesn't think that that sounds right. And that's because whether then pleasure counts as good or not, if that's true, then whether pleasure counts as good or not depends on what it's derived from, and that shows Aristotle thinks that pleasure isn't intrinsically good. It's not the case that it can be desired for its own sake, because when it's produced in an inappropriate way, it's not desirable. It's not good. This is where Aristotle advances his theory of what happiness is, which is not what the average person thinks, but we'll give it a shot and see how far we can get with it. So, for happiness for Aristotle is a kind of activity. It's not a mental state. It's not having pleasure. You can see that pleasure isn't intrinsically good by the kinds of things we've been thinking about, and rather, happiness is living one's life in the right way, what we might say a satisfying, well-lived life, one who flourishes in the world. They have friends, they have family, they have a job, they don't need to be super wealthy, but they have enough money not to worry about money. They pursue their own interests. They're well respected by their peers. They're known to be good at what they do. They are just all around well off in every sense of that word. And it's not just financially. It's that they're rich in the things that life can provide. That, for Aristotle, is happiness. And it doesn't mean that you feel a certain way. It means that you're doing something. You're performing these things in the right way. Now, just really quickly, let me give you a way to see the difference here. So it's a bit scientifical, if that's a word. Let me coin it. But it'll help us see what's going on here. So imagine two different situations. So the first situation is a person who's living the kind of life that I was just describing. Someone who's healthy, happy, has family, loved ones, children, has a job, has their health, has property, respect, they're good at their job, people recognize that they're good at their job, whatever that it is that they do, people say, yeah, that person's great at that job. I wish I could do it like he does or she does. Everyone likes this person. They have friends. They're respected by their peers, etc. So this person just doing a fantastic job at living life, just all around. Now, so you have that on the one hand. Now imagine on the other hand, you have a person who's in some artificial situation like the Matrix. So we all know what the Matrix is. The Matrix is a case where in real life, quote unquote, you are a body in a vat. You're in this machine, and you're hooked up to various wires and tubes in your brain and throughout all your body, actually, so you can stimulate the nerves in any way that they want to. And your nerves and brain are being stimulated in such a way that it causes in you the conscious experience as of a bunch of stuff happening that isn't really happening. So the people in the Matrix think that they're going to work, they get up in the morning, they get dressed, they drive their car, they punch the clock, they go out to the club, they take ecstasy, they drink beers, they do all the things that you think you do, except they're not really doing it. They are in real life laying in this machine, and their nerves are being stimulated in various ways. So now imagine someone in this Matrix-like scenario who doesn't know it. They think that they're living a real life outside of the Matrix. Now imagine that they are living a Matrix version of the first scenario. So in this matrix life that they live, they're happy, they're healthy, people respect them, they have a job that people think they're good at, except of course they're the only person there. They're living this simulation of all of this stuff, and none of it's real. Now, ask yourself, which of these would you rather be in? Experientially, notice they're exactly the same. So all the pleasure that you feel in one, you'll feel in the other. The pleasures of a good life, the taste of the food, the aesthetic beauty of the sights, basking in the warmth of the glow of approval of your peers, etc. All that stuff's going to feel the same, except in one case you're in an actual physical world with real people, and in another case you're in this virtual matrix world computer simulation. Now, which of those would you rather be in? Now, some people say it doesn't matter, right? It feels the same. But if you think that it does matter, that there's something about the real scenario that's good or better, whereas in the virtual scenario it's not, then it's not just the pleasure that makes this good. It's something about it, the activity of doing it, of really doing it. Not pretending to do it, not virtually doing it, but really doing it. Now, if you think that that's right, then you might sort of see what Aristotle's getting at as far as this life well lived stuff. And we do talk this way in English sometimes, where we use the word happy not to specify a feeling, but a time. So we say, back when I was a kid, we'd go to the lake every summer and go fishing with my grandpa, whatever, hamada, and then you might say, that was a happy time in my life. That was, really good time for me. And it may not even have been that you were feeling pleasure at every moment that you were there. It's just that you remember that that was a time where you were doing things well, where things were going well for you. Now, this is important for Aristotle because now he's going to give his actual theory of what this is, what happiness is. So he's building up this argument, starting from an analysis of action to what happiness is and how we can achieve it. So here's the summary, by the way, of the argument that ethics is the science of happiness. I won't rehash that. I just hashed it a second ago, so I won't rehash it. So the point we're at now is that happiness is living well, which is to do well at life. And now here's where Aristotle's genius comes in, because what he notices, and what he's been aiming at all along, actually, in this chain of argument, is that when we say that something does well, we use the function that the thing is built for as a way of evaluating whether the object in question is good. So, for instance, take a knife. We say that a knife does well when it cuts well. That's because a knife's function is to cut. And notice that a knife that fulfills its function, one that does what it's supposed to do in the sense of function, is a good knife. So we say that's a good knife. It really cuts well. Now, a pencil also does well if it writes well. That's a really good pencil. A heart does well if it pumps blood. You have a good heart, not in the metaphorical sense of being charitable, but having a good heart or a bad heart in the literal sense of having heart disease or having clogs in one's arteries, etc., etc. Now, by analogy, if humans are going to do well, it should be because they perform their function, the thing they're supposed to do, in the right way. Now, this of course brings us to the question of, well, wait a minute, do humans have a function? So Aristotle thinks that humans do have a function, that it's not weird to talk this way. In fact, he argues it's strange to talk the other way. So think of a person and their body. So take an animal, for instance. Every part of a person's body has a function. So the heart has a function, it pumps blood. The liver has a function, it filters things. The kidneys have a function, the intestines have a function. Every part of you, it has a function. So two, every person in society has a function. Some of us are doctors, some of us are students, some of us are teachers, some of us are cab drivers, some of us are grocery store clerks, some of us are presidents of the United States, some of us are advisors to the president, news reporters, manufacturers, etc. Every person does something in the society which is a function. They have a job. Species also have functions. If you notice, we say of one that it's a scavenger, that it serves a certain purpose in nature. Some things seem to be prey, so there's carnivores, and then there's preys, and then there's scavengers. And so it would be very interesting if human beings were the only thing in this hierarchy. And notice there's a kind of hierarchy here, going from parts of a thing to the whole thing to the species that the thing is a part of. It would be kind of strange, Aristotle thinks, if this species, human beings, rational animals, as he would call them, if those things didn't have a function too. Now, a function is that thing which is unique to the object and which distinguishes it from other things like it. So, the function of a knife is to cut because it was made to cut. Right? That's its purpose. That's what it was fashioned to do. So that is the thing which distinguishes it from other objects. That's why a knife isn't a spoon. Now you can use a spoon to cut, but that's not a spoon's purpose. So too, you can use a knife to scoop up some stuff, but that's not a knife's purpose. Now, the function of the heart is to pump blood. That's what it does, which distinguishes it from other things which are organs. So you have a general class of things, organs, and then you have differentiating properties which individuate particular organs. The blood pumping organ, the blood filtering organ, the air providing organ, etc., etc. So you have the class of thing and the thing which differentiates members of the class. So too in the knife, the general class would be silverware, cutlery. And then you can differentiate the individual pieces of silverware by what functions they are supposed to perform. The spoon for scooping, the knife for cutting, the fork for grabbing, etc. So, well, what is it that distinguishes humans? It's not living, since plants do that, and animals do that, and we do that. So that's something that we all have in common. It's not merely perception or movement, because animals do that as well. Animals can perceive their environment, they move themselves around. Plants can't do that, so animals and humans have in common doing this. But of course, what we have that they don't have is rationality. That's what we've already mentioned. And so the class of things is animals. That's what we have in common with other things that move and so on. We're animals. But what differentiates us from the other animals is our rationality. In particular, it's this business about syllogisms and logic and being able to think abstractly, which animals can't do. So when Aristotle says rationality, he doesn't mean the kind of thing that Aristotle does. The kind of thing that Aristotle or Einstein do. What he means is the kind of thing the average person does when they say, if all animals are mammals and this dog is an animal, then it's a mammal. And that's something that even the least intelligent person out there is able to grasp, that if all of a certain kind of thing are one way, then any example of that kind of thing are one way. And they may not be able to grasp the abstractness of it and in various subtleties of it, but it's sort of obvious that this is the case. So rationality is something that all human beings have as a species, even if individual members of that species aren't as what we would call smart in our colloquial terms as other people. So he's not talking about smartness. He's just talking about this ability that all human beings have to see general patterns of inference, which dogs, cats, so on cannot do. So, from this, Aristotle concludes that people have as their function rationality. That's our purpose. Our purpose is to be rational. That's what makes us different from the other kinds of things around here. That's what gives us our unique place in the world, our rational faculties. We are the rational animal. Now, since happiness means living well, and something does well when it fulfills its function well, when it does what it's supposed to do, happiness is therefore acting rationally well. It's doing that well. So, what is the view that he's arrived at? Ethics is the science of achieving this intrinsic good, happiness. And what happiness is fulfilling a certain kind of function. Our function turns out to be our function turns out to be rationality. So, what do you do when you live well? Well, it must mean that you're acting rationally somehow. So ultimately, even though it looks like this is a kind of view that's grounded in self-interest, you want happiness, so that's why you should act in this way. But the real twist here is that it's rationality which is going to be doing a lot of the work. So if you want to be happy, Aristotle is saying, your actions have to be rational. But how do we fulfill this function? Right? How do we act rationally? Right? How does it mean to say that our actions are rational? Well, this is again where Aristotle draws on his general theory. So, generally speaking, objects fulfill their functions by having certain virtues. Now, a virtue is simply by definition whatever it is that allows an object to fulfill its function. So, for instance, the virtues of a knife are the properties that knives can possess, in virtue of which they cut well. Now notice that this use of virtue is very different from the modern use of virtue. Aristotle's perfectly happy saying that a knife is virtuous, or that a horse is virtuous, or that a car is virtuous, or that a computer is virtuous, or that a person is virtuous.